Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I didn't cry at the funeral, not because I wasn't grieving, but because there was a kind of numbness that settled in me like concrete from the second the call came. The kind that keeps your face still and your hands steady even when your heart is breaking open under your ribs. My father, Raymond Walker, was gone, just like that, a man who had spent his entire life building something out of sweat, grit, and unforgiving discipline, taken from us by a heart attack so swift it didn't even give him time to say goodbye. One moment he was in his office, probably scribbling on a yellow legal pad like always, and the next moment he was just a story people whispered in hushed voices at the church reception. There were casseroles and fake condolences, lukewarm hugs from people I hadn't seen in years, and endless platitudes that rang hollow in my ears as I stood near the casket. My mother, Janine, hovering close by with red-rimmed eyes and that fragile look of a woman who had forgotten how to exist without her husband's structure holding everything in place. My brother Derek, of course, played his role flawlessly, the dutiful son, the one who everyone said handled everything with grace, shaking hands and offering tissue boxes with a sympathetic face that I knew all too well was just a mask for calculation. I stood back and watched him work the room like a politician, and I felt something stir in my gut. Not grief, not yet, but something colder and far more dangerous. It wasn't until a week later, when we gathered at the lawyer's office for the reading of the will, that the real fracture began to reveal itself. I'd never expected riches or grandeur, just something, a piece of my father's legacy, a recognition that I had stood beside him, worked beside him, loved him in my own quiet way, even when he didn't always know how to show it in return. I'd spent years shadowing him in the business when I was younger, learning the inner workings of Walker Manufacturing, taking notes while he dictated late into the night, running numbers he didn't trust anyone else to touch. I didn't want to take over the company, but I thought, at the very least, he'd left me a share of something more than sentiment. But when the lawyer began to speak, I felt my stomach turn into ice. The estate, according to the documents, had been restructured. The house, the company's shares, even the savings accounts, all of it had been transferred to Derek under something called a revised asset trust, signed just 2 months before our father's death. I stared at the papers in silence while my mother sat beside me, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor like she couldn't bear to meet mine. Derek didn't even pretend to be shocked. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and offered me a smirk that made my blood burn in my veins. "Don't take it personally, Claire," he said, his voice syrupy with false concern. "Dad probably figured you weren't interested in the business anymore. You've got your own thing going on, right? Teaching or writing, or whatever it is you do." Then, he leaned in just enough for his voice to drop into that smug little whisper I'd heard too many times in childhood arguments. "Besides, you were never really cut out for this. Too soft to fight in this world." I didn't answer. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't storm out or throw a fit like he probably expected me to. I just sat there, perfectly still, letting the heat simmer in my chest while I carefully folded the papers and slid them back across the table. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd just vanish quietly, maybe cry in my car, maybe rant to a friend over a glass of cheap wine, but ultimately fade into the background like always. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. I went back to the house that evening, the same house I'd grown up in, now technically his by paper, but still holding pieces of my father that couldn't be erased by a signature. My mother was there, moving slowly through the living room like a ghost, not saying much, not looking me in the eye. I didn't push. I didn't ask her why she let this happen, why she stood by and watched Derek claim everything like he'd earned it with anything more than a few smug words and an inflated sense of entitlement. I just went upstairs to my father's study, the one room Derek never liked, never respected, never understood. The room smelled like old leather and ink, a scent that clung to my father like a second skin. I ran my fingers along the bookshelf, along the edge of the desk, until something caught my eye, a wooden box tucked beneath a stack of trade journals and blueprints. It was locked, but the key was still in the bottom drawer, right where I remembered he kept it. Inside were documents, some old, some new, but one folder stood out, thicker, marked with my name in his handwriting. My heart thudded in my chest as I pulled it out and opened it slowly, my hands trembling just slightly. And what I saw inside made me sit down so hard the chair creaked beneath me. Because what I held wasn't just sentimental letters or forgotten mementos. It was something that didn't make sense, something legal, something financial, something that raised more questions than answers. And I knew right then that this wasn't over. Not even close. The thing no one ever wants to talk about in families like mine is just how much of a man's success is held up by the hands no one ever sees. People like to glorify the figurehead, the patriarch, the visionary, the man who built an empire from nothing but his own 2 hands and a sharp mind. And yes, my father was that man in many ways. Raymond Walker built Walker Manufacturing from a tiny garage with 2 employees and a set of steel cutting tools that barely worked half the time. He hustled, he bargained, he worked until his knuckles cracked and his back gave out, and he made something solid from nothing at all. But behind every late night and early morning, behind every deal signed and every client won, there were other people moving the wheels, people like me. I started working at the company when I was 19, just after my first year of college, because I wanted to understand what made him tick. I wasn't interested in legacy or entitlement. I just wanted to be close to him, to learn something real and tangible in a world that was increasingly full of noise and nonsense. While Derek was off chasing some business degree he never finished and partying on his father's dime, I was in the office learning how to manage vendor accounts, helping develop new pricing models, even redesigning the client intake system to streamline workflow. I wasn't just a shadow behind the desk. I was making real contributions, and everyone who worked there at the time knew it. I remember sitting in Dad's office late one evening, flipping through budget sheets while he dictated notes for the quarterly report. He'd pause sometimes, glance over, and ask for my opinion. Not in a patronizing way, not just to humor me, but because he genuinely wanted to know what I thought. I pitched him the idea of moving part of our production digital, suggested expanding into e-commerce before it was trendy, and convinced him to take a meeting with a supplier I'd scouted from an industry convention. That meeting turned into a contract that lasted 6 years and saved the company thousands in overhead. But you won't find my name on any of those records. You won't see it on the plaques or the boardroom wall. Because Derek made sure to rewrite history the second he wormed his way into Dad's trust. He came back into the picture like a savior. That's how my mother always described it. Said he was finally ready to get serious about the business, finally ready to make his mark. But all he did was nudge me out with fake politeness and forced smiles, little by little, until I found myself consulting from home and eventually phased out altogether. No big confrontation. No formal firing. Just the slow erasure of a presence he always considered inconvenient. And I let it happen because I was tired and because my father didn't push back. He probably thought he was keeping the peace. He didn't realize he was handing over everything to a man who had never lifted a finger when it actually mattered. After I found that folder in the study, though, something inside me clicked. There were copies of old partnership documents, internal memos, and something that looked a lot like preliminary co-ownership paperwork. My father had been planning something, that much was clear. But it was unfinished, unsigned, scattered in pieces like a puzzle dumped onto the floor. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to raise questions, questions Derek was clearly hoping no one would ask. So I started asking them. I reached out to Carl Whitman, one of my father's oldest clients, a no-nonsense man who used to send me handwritten thank you notes after every project. I called Sheila in HR, who remembered how I'd reorganized the onboarding process 3 years ago. I even met with Tony from logistics for coffee, and he told me flat out, "You were the one who kept that place from sinking when Derek started making decisions." Piece by piece, I was stitching together a narrative that had been deliberately buried, one that showed just how much of that company's foundation had my fingerprints all over it. And I realized that I didn't just want justice for what was stolen from me. I wanted acknowledgement for what I had given, not in sentiment or half-hearted apologies, but in writing, in structure, in ownership. The real turning point came when I tracked down my father's old accountant, a man named Leonard Hale who had retired 2 years prior, but still kept meticulous records and, more importantly, a fiercely loyal sense of integrity. I drove 2 hours to his lakeside cabin, sat on his porch with coffee, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally, his eyes narrowing when I told him how Derek had taken over everything after Dad died. When I finished, he stood, went inside, and returned with a thick binder of financial records, legal notes, and correspondence that dated back nearly a decade. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it to me. And I did. I didn't open the binder right away, not because I wasn't desperate to see what was inside, but because something in me needed a moment to breathe before I cracked it open and confirmed what I already suspected deep in my bones. It sat on the passenger seat of my car the whole ride home, heavy and ominous like a sleeping animal I wasn't ready to wake. I glanced over at it more times than I could count, fingers twitching against the steering wheel, mind spinning with everything Leonard had said and everything he hadn't. There was a weight to that binder beyond the paper inside. It carried years of buried truth, of promises made behind closed doors, of silent trust that had been ignored, manipulated, and dismissed by people who assumed I would never dare to rise. When I finally sat down at my kitchen table that evening, the sun already dipped behind the trees and casting long orange shadows across the floor, I flipped open the cover with a kind of reverence, almost like I was unsealing something sacred. The first few pages were familiar old bank records, vendor contracts, tax statements that painted a picture of the company's steady growth. But then, nestled halfway through, clipped together and marked with a bright red tab, was something I hadn't expected to find so plainly. It was a copy of a partnership agreement, not a draft, not a rough outline, but a full legal document naming me as a silent co-owner of Walker Manufacturing. Dated 6 years prior and bearing both my father's signature and a space where mine had been left blank. I stared at it, reading the lines over and over, trying to wrap my head around what it meant. According to the clause Leonard had highlighted, the agreement would become binding if my father filed certain supplementary documents with the state and the company's internal records, a step he could have taken without my knowledge. A step, according to Leonard's notes and dated correspondence, that he had in fact taken just 3 months before his death. There it was, clear as day, a letter from my father's attorney confirming that the required filings had been submitted and accepted. Leonard looked into it himself, and everything checked out. I wasn't just the daughter who used to help with spreadsheets and employee training. I wasn't just the outsider they pushed out when it got inconvenient. I was, by every legal measure, the silent co-owner of the business Derek thought he had claimed entirely for himself. The truth was sitting in my lap the entire time, and Derek didn't know a damn thing about it. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel triumphant, not yet. What I felt, more than anything, was clarity, the kind that slices through fog like a knife, sharp and unyielding and impossible to ignore. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head, not some dramatic movie monologue, but his usual blunt tone, the one he used when something mattered. "I know you don't need handouts, Claire. But that doesn't mean you should be cheated out of what's yours." He'd said something like that to me once, late one night after Derek had flaked out on a project again, and I'd stayed behind to finish the work alone. I'd brushed it off at the time, chalked it up to tired praise, but now it echoed like a warning I'd failed to heed. Still, I needed to be sure. Documents were one thing, but strategy was another. If I was going to fight this, I had to do it right, with facts, precision, and airtight execution. So the next morning, I called my father's old lawyer, a man named Richard Cole, known for his sharp memory, dry wit, and ironclad contracts. He hadn't represented the company in years, but he'd been my father's personal counsel for over a decade and would have known if this arrangement was ever meant to hold real weight. When I arrived at his office, tucked behind an unassuming strip of brick buildings downtown, he greeted me with a raised brow and a firm handshake. He didn't waste time with small talk, just gestured toward the chair across from his desk and asked, "What brings you here, Claire?" I laid everything out for him, from the documents Leonard had provided to the details I'd uncovered in my father's study. He listened silently, flipping through the paperwork with practiced ease, I scanning each line like a surgeon preparing for an incision. When he finally looked up, he didn't hesitate. "Your father was deliberate about this," he said calmly. "These aren't just ceremonial filings or sentimental gestures. These are structured, legal moves, ones that put you in a position of authority, whether your brother likes it or not." He tapped a specific page with his pen and added, "If you want to push it, I can make it happen. You're entitled to half the company. And there's not a damn thing he can do about it." I sat back in my chair, letting the words wash over me. Half the company. Not as a gift. Not as pity. As a rightful stake, earned, documented, legal. And suddenly, the game shifted. All this time, Derek thought he'd won because I hadn't thrown a fit, because I'd walked away quietly while he patted his ego with stolen legacy and undeserved praise. But I hadn't walked away. I'd simply been waiting, calculating, watching for the right moment to take everything back. And now, that moment was closer than ever. I've always believed there's something strangely powerful about keeping your rage quiet, about smiling through the insult and holding your composure while every cell in your body screams to retaliate. That's exactly what I did the next week when I walked into Derek's office, dressed in a plain blazer and soft beige slacks, the perfect image of civility, politeness, and predictable disappointment. He didn't even stand up when I walked in, just leaned back in his chair like a king lounging in a throne built on paper-thin illusions and inherited arrogance. I had to fight the urge to laugh because he looked so sure of himself, so smug, so safe in the idea that he had already won, and I was just another nuisance to be patted on the head and shown the door. "Claire," he said, flashing that hollow smile that had always grated on me more than any outright insult. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. Everything okay?" His tone was soaked in fake concern, the kind that people use when they know damn well they've wronged you and expect you to come crawling for crumbs. I smiled, even though I wanted to slap that look off his face, and sat across from him as if we were just catching up like old friends. "I just wanted to talk," I said simply, keeping my voice even and light, like I was there to find closure, not retribution. "I've been thinking about things, about how everything's turned out. I guess I just needed to make peace with it all." He nodded, clearly pleased with himself, misreading me in every possible way. He pulled open a drawer, slid a small white envelope across the desk, and gestured toward it like it was some grand gesture of generosity. "I figured you might come around," he said. "I know this has been hard for you. I talked to Mom, and we thought maybe this would help." I opened the envelope and pulled out a check, a measly sum compared to what he'd taken, not even a fraction of what the company was worth. It wasn't even insulting because I knew exactly what it was meant to be, a peace offering wrapped in condescension, a way for him to buy off my silence and convince himself he'd done the noble thing. I stared at the check for a few seconds, then tucked it back in the envelope and slipped it into my purse with a nod. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, not for the money, but for the fact that he'd just made everything easier. He had no idea that every word out of his mouth, every patronizing smile, every casual dismissal was digging his own grave, brick by smug brick. He kept talking after that, going on about new contracts, expansion plans, how he was taking the business to the next level. I nodded and smiled, occasionally asking just the right questions to make him think I cared, all while silently savoring the fact that the documents were already in motion, signed, filed, and sealed under the careful guidance of my father's old attorney and 2 bulletproof legal assistants. Later that night, I met Becca at our usual corner bar, the kind of place where the drinks are strong, the lights are low, and the booths still have the kind of cracked leather that makes you feel like something happened there long before you ever arrived. I told her everything over 2 glasses of red wine, laid it out like a script I'd rehearsed in my head a dozen times. She laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her drink when I described Derek's face as he handed me that ridiculous check. "God, you're good," she said, grinning from ear to ear. The slow burn of revenge is always the best kind. It's not petty, it's precision. Like a scalpel, not a hammer. But then her expression softened, and she reached across the table, touching my hand. But are you sure you want to go through with it? I mean, you've already proven you're smarter than him 10 times over. What more do you need? Her question landed heavier than I expected, and for a second, I actually hesitated. Was it worth it? Was I really doing this to reclaim what was mine, or was it just about watching him squirm, about seeing that smirk finally disappear from his face? I didn't answer her right away because the truth was messier than I wanted to admit. There was part of me that wanted closure, yes, absolutely. But there was also a deeper part, the part that remembered every time I'd been dismissed, overlooked, cut out, that wanted justice in a language Derek could actually understand: ownership, power, control. I don't know, I said finally, staring into my wine. Maybe it is petty. But if it is, then maybe petty's been underrated this whole time. Becca just raised her glass and clinked it against mine. Then here's to petty. May it be loud, legal, and lucrative. I laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it felt genuine. As I walked back to my car that night, the city buzzing around me and the sky thick with clouds threatening rain, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the message glowing on the screen, simple and clean like a spark in the dark. Contracts ready. When do we deliver the news? There's something strangely thrilling about orchestrating a moment you know is going to change everything, especially when you're the only one at the table who knows what's coming. That morning, as I got dressed, buttoning my blouse with deliberate calm and fixing my hair with more care than usual, I wasn't thinking about revenge or victory or even pride. I was thinking about control, about what it means to take it back quietly, precisely, without raising your voice or breaking a single glass. I had already chosen the restaurant, a sleek little bistro on the east side of town with overpriced sandwiches and smooth jazz playing at just the right volume to sound like civility. It was neutral territory, far enough from the office that Derek wouldn't suspect anything serious, but familiar enough that he wouldn't turn it down. When I called him earlier that week and said we should meet for lunch, just the two of us, his reaction was exactly what I expected. A short pause, followed by a smug little chuckle and a carefully disguised tone of condescension wrapped in false concern. "Of course, Claire," he said. "It's good you're moving on. Let's clear the air." He had no idea what kind of air he was about to breathe in, no clue that the woman he still thought of as soft, fragile, easily dismissed, was about to turn his carefully stolen empire inside out. I arrived early and took the table near the window, the one with just enough sunlight to feel pleasant but not too exposed. I ordered water and sat there calmly, watching people pass by on the sidewalk, wondering how many of them had ever sat across from someone they loved and plotted their downfall with this much precision. When Derek walked in, wearing one of his obnoxiously tailored suits and flashing that rehearsed smile, I almost admired his commitment to the performance. He looked so comfortable in his illusion, so certain of his power, it almost felt cruel to take it away. Almost. "Claire," he said as he sat down, loosening his tie just enough to suggest he was relaxed, in control, untouched by anything I might say. "You're looking well. I hope this means we're finally putting everything behind us." I smiled gently, nodded, let him talk. He launched into a monologue about business expansion, new deals, how the company was finally hitting its stride, all while pretending that I was just a footnote in a story he'd already written. I listened, sipped my water, nodded at all the right moments, and didn't say a word about what was coming next. Exactly 20 minutes in, right on schedule, a figure approached our table, calm and composed, holding a thin leather briefcase and an expression of polite neutrality. Derek looked up, confused for a second, then irritated when he recognized Mr. Cole, my father's old attorney, now officially mine. "Richard," Derek said, his voice sharp with surprise. "What the hell are you doing here?" Mr. Cole didn't bother with small talk. He pulled out a folder, opened it with surgical precision, and placed a stack of documents directly in front of Derek. "I'm here on behalf of Claire," he said simply. "You've been served." Derek laughed, short and awkward, as if this were some sort of joke, some prank I'd pulled to prove a petty point. But the moment he glanced down at the papers, his laughter died. His eyes scanned the first few lines, then the next page, and I watched his face drain of all its practiced arrogance. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, realization setting in like a cold flood. He looked up at me then, not with amusement, not with pity, but with something dangerously close to panic. This can't be right, he said, voice cracking slightly as he looked back to Mr. Cole. This is a mistake. This has to be a mistake. Mr. Cole remained composed, his voice even and sharp. It's not a mistake. Your father filed the necessary paperwork before his death. Claire is a legal co-owner of Walker Manufacturing, entitled to 50% of the business assets, operations, and decision-making authority. The documentation has been filed with the state and the corporate registrar. It's binding. Derek's jaw clenched, his hands now visibly shaking. You can't just walk in here and take half of everything. She didn't earn this. I've been running the business. I've made it what it is. I leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes with calm clarity. You're right. You've been running it, into the ground. I built this with Dad. You just dressed it up in empty suits and called it yours. But now it's mine too, not because you allowed it, but because you couldn't stop it. He sat there in stunned silence for several seconds, blinking as if trying to wake from a bad dream, then pushed the papers away violently, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You'll regret this, Claire, he said, voice low and bitter, every word soaked in venom. You don't belong in my world. I smiled again, softer this time, as if his words didn't burn, because they didn't. They bounced right off the armor I had spent a lifetime building. Maybe I don't, I said, gathering my purse and standing slowly. But you forgot something, Derek. It's not your world anymore. I turned and walked away before he could reply, my heels clicking softly on the tile, the sound of quiet victory echoing behind me. There was something strangely surreal about walking through those glass doors again, not as an outsider or a forgotten fixture of the past, but as a woman with title, power, and place, not because someone handed it to me out of pity, not because I begged or pleaded for acknowledgement, but because I claimed what had always been mine to begin with. The lobby hadn't changed much, the same cold marble floor beneath my feet, the same hum of printers and low voices drifting through the air, the same receptionist desk where I had once sat answering phones and filing contracts while Derek strutted around pretending to be the genius behind it all. But this time, every step I took echoed with a different kind of weight, not the heaviness of being overlooked, but the quiet strength of belonging on my own terms. I didn't walk in with fanfare or entourage, didn't make a speech or demand attention. I simply stepped through the place like I had every right to, because I did. And as I passed the front desk, Sandra, who had been with the company longer than either of us, looked up and smiled, her face lighting up in a way that caught me completely off guard. Claire, she said warmly, standing to greet me, it's good to see you again. I smiled back, genuinely this time, and nodded. It's good to be back. Word had spread quickly after the documents were filed. I didn't need to announce my presence or explain my position. Everyone already knew. And yet, what surprised me most wasn't the acknowledgement of my title, but the way people responded to my presence, not with skepticism or awkwardness, but with a kind of quiet respect that had been absent all those years ago when I was just the girl behind the spreadsheets and project binders. Jerry from accounting came over to shake my hand, asked if I remembered the old vendor integration system we'd built together. Marcy from procurement gave me a quick hug in the hallway and whispered, "Took them long enough." It was more than kindness. It was validation, not loud, not performative, just honest recognition that maybe they'd seen me all along, even when my own family hadn't. I didn't go into my father's old office. I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I sat in the corner conference room with my coffee and stared out the window, watching the cars pass and the clouds shift. It wasn't about control for me. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. It was about dignity, about restoring a balance that should never have been so violently tilted in the first place. I didn't want to rub it in Derek's face, didn't want to mock him or gloat or revel in his discomfort, even though I would be lying if I said it didn't satisfy something deep inside me to see that arrogant certainty wiped clean from his expression. My mother called that afternoon, her voice soft and tentative, the way it always was when she was trying to smooth over damage without really acknowledging it existed. "Claire," she said, "I just wanted to say I hope you're doing okay. Derek, he's having a hard time with all this. He didn't mean to hurt you, you know." I stood in the hallway, holding the phone loosely to my ear, listening to her speak like a woman tiptoeing through a conversation she knew she couldn't win. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why she'd never stood up for me, why she had watched him push me out and stayed silent. I didn't bring up the years of imbalance or the million tiny betrayals. I just smiled, that same small, unreadable smile I'd worn at the lawyer's office, and said, "I'm doing just fine, Mom." Really. And I was. I walked through that building not as a conqueror, not as a victim, but as someone who had simply decided she was done being erased. I didn't take back the company to prove anything to Derek or even to my parents. I took it back because I could, because I should have never been pushed out in the first place, because my silence had been mistaken for surrender for far too long, and it was time to let them feel what I had carried for years. But still, I didn't know if I would stay. Part of me wanted to sell my share, walk away with my head high and my pockets full, finally free of the weight of family expectations and obligations that never seemed to benefit anyone but my brother. Another part of me wanted to stay, to build something new from the ashes of what they'd tried to burn down, to reshape this place in a way that actually honored my father's legacy, not Derek's ambition. I don't have the answer yet. Maybe I never will. Maybe that's the point, that not every story ends in a clear resolution or a triumphant finale. Sometimes, the win is just in taking back the pen and writing the damn ending yourself. I didn't do it to win. I did it because I was tired of being erased. So let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, if someone took what was yours and smiled while they did it, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have made your move?